The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The World of the Sufi by Idries Shah. 1. Introduction. According to the Sufis, human beings are ordinarily cut off from objective reality, which is the origin of everything. Human faculties, although perceptive, are limited. Like a radio set which can receive only certain electromagnetic waves and not other parts of this band, all perceptions exclude external impulses as well as receiving others. The perceived world, again according to this assertion, is therefore a distortion. The inability to transcend the barrier of limited senses explains human subjectivity, and secondary effects are usually perceived as primary ones. So Rumi says in his Fihi ma fihi, if a sleeve moves, it is because the hand moved. But if the hand moves, the sleeve does not always have to move. So if you look at the caused and do not know the causer, you imagine that the sleeve is something which has a life of its own. The Sufis further assert that they can penetrate beyond the apparent to the real in this sense, and Sufism is the method, or rather, provides the methods for this enterprise. They state further that theirs is a spiritual path, because their experience, in their judgment, verifies that the objective truth, the first cause, that which lies beyond appearances, is divine. The methods which are adopted to pierce the veil between truth and humankind are accordingly those chosen by experienced Sufis. Nobody who has not completed this journey can properly be called a Sufi. Someone who is only trying is known as a seeker, a dervish, and by other names. The ones which their own overview tells them are appropriate for the current time, place, and people. This explains why so many Sufis have worked in so many fields, and why so many Sufi schools have had so many different conceptions of the path. Sufism is, in operation, pragmatic. Most of the supposedly Sufi organizations, exercises, and orders are in fact only of archaeological interest. Those who know do not need them. Those who do not must find those who know, not the obsolete garments of previous formulations. It cannot be denied, even from an outside point of view, that someone who has been along a certain path may be able to conduct others by that route, or find a better one, both enterprises being more promising than a route from an old map which has been rendered irrelevant by a landslide. Whether acceptable by outward minds or not, the contention cannot be faulted if the premises are conceded. If this is so, then, it may be asked, what is the use of the map which is now said to be superseded? Why collect accounts of former enterprises and their activities? The answer is that these materials have a use other than the leading of a disciple from A to Z. Just as it would be absurd to imagine that an orange was only taste, only color, only flavor, or only a vehicle for seeds in its value to us, so with Sufi expressions. On one of the lowest, but yet fundamental levels, the value lies in removing misconceptions about humanity and human thinking and about narrowness in Sufi studies. It is easy to illustrate one of the important uses of this kind of material from an experiment carried out in the case of the present book. The manuscript of the work which you are now reading was given to specialists in several fields, and to a number of general readers and metaphysicians, all of them with some interest in Sufism and the Sufis. The results were illuminating. A psychiatrist was delighted at the psychological content, but confessed himself uncomfortable with the religious and literary material. A theologian was distressed by the mystical content, but loved the spiritual beauty which he found herein. An historian and Orientalist was thrilled by the new information not available elsewhere, but at the same time annoyed that Sufi studies should have been embraced by modern workers in the soft sciences, such as psychologists. A literary critic felt that the work of the great thinkers and writers in this tradition should be retained, the rest excised. In other words, each wanted to regard the Sufi expression as a part of his or her own field. Each, too, when questioned, admitted to preferring that the relevance to any other field be censored or suppressed. This reaction, for it is only one reaction in pattern, though apparently several because expressed variously in literary, scientific, academic, and other category terms, well delineates the mentality of a number of typical contemporary people. It gives us a means of assessing them and, it is to be hoped, gives them a means of noting their own limitations. And there are other contents in this material which can take effect long before any learning in Sufism can be promoted, but which can nevertheless pave the way for it. Happily, there were other and sufficiently wholesome responses to the materials which alone could justify publication. We could have pleased every one of our specialists by splitting the manuscripts into narrow categories, adding more material in the same field, and publishing each fragment as a separate book. The list of titles would then have read, at least in part, Sufism, the Classical Tradition, Humour and the Sufis, Sufism in Eastern Religion, Modern Psychology and Sufi Thought and Action, Sufi Spiritual Practices, Visits to Sufis, the Sufis in Literature, East and West, and so on. The only problem left would have been that the Sufic content, value, and impact would have disappeared. There was once a boy, you may recall, who dismembered a butterfly. Looking at the piles of wings, antennae, legs, head, and body, he exclaimed, "There are the parts all right, but where has the butterfly gone?" This behavior is so well understood in the East that there is a term derived from this story, pai magas, fly's leg, to refer to perhaps interesting but ultimately incomplete specialization. Because certain subjects have been made specializations, and because there is a habit of putting labels on things, both admirable tendencies if kept within proper bounds, the habit of collecting butterfly legs has come to be accepted very widely as equal to, or a suitable substitute for, the study of butterflies. Many people will deny this, talking about fragmentation, classification, and holisticism. But you only have to talk to many of them for a time and watch their behavior and methods of thought to know that, in general, these tend to be parrot cries. In case anyone jumps to conclusions, let me say here that this book is not a reconstructed butterfly. It contains material within a very wide range, both of subject and of competence and relevance. As an anthology of readings, it seems to me to contain a great deal that is useful, but much will depend upon what assumptions are brought to its reading. If my own experience is anything to go by, the book will produce as many reactions as there are types of people reading it. Unless carefully warned, the reactions to books include some very superficial behavior. Some of the readers might embark on journeys to the East, others might lose no time in trying out exercises, yet others are likely to use it to manifest a desire for acceptance or rejection, to like or dislike it. I say this because I have noticed that there is a tendency to employ books to help one work out a desire already existing in the mind, regardless of the balance of the material. As responses to one and the same book, I have found people, or rather they have found me, who have gone on long journeys, rushed to look for texts mentioned in the book, tried to spread the good word, plunged into the world or fled it. I sometimes have a fantasy that I would like to put them all into a room and have them fight out which of their highly selective interpretations is the right one. This kind of behavior ignores, of course, the fundamental priority, the question as to whether the admittedly heroic seeker is equipped for the particular effort which has taken his fancy, for fancy it is in such cases. I once gave a lecture in the United States, during the course of which I made much play of the fact that to adopt so-called spiritual exercises and to try to use them without knowledge was positively to be avoided. At the end of the lecture, I was surrounded by people who wanted to be given lists of exercises. In another lecture, before an assembly of scholars, and at their invitation, I spoke at length about the fact that Sufism is not and cannot be a scholarly specialization, nor does it contain any such specializations. The first question I got at the end of the lecture was, "Yes, but what are the actual scholarly specializations within Sufism?" When I asked whether the rest of the audience wanted an answer to this, nearly all the assembled savants held up their hands. So, as can easily be demonstrated, both the metaphysical and the academic are relatively rigid sets of mind laboring under a similar restriction, lack of flexibility, and a feeble ability to absorb new material. The Sufi, in common with others, of course, has a different point of view. He may help others to attain it, or perhaps rather to reclaim it, though indoctrination and habit, plus vanity and emotionality, can prevent the useful absorption of what is, in fact, only common sense. The employment of materials such as those in this book for information gathering or emotional stimulus would yield no more, even if no less, than any other book adopted for such secondary purposes. In the Sufi phrase, the colour of the water seems to be the colour of the glass into which it has been poured. Idries Shah. 2. The Classical Tradition of the Sufi. 2 Part 1. The Classical Masters, by Peter Brent. It is impossible to be clear about beginnings. A tradition winds back through the centuries. One says, "Here it commenced," or "That was the man who spoke the first word." But however firm one's tone of voice, however dogmatic one's assertion, one cannot lay bare the earliest, the primal root. This is the more true, the more imprecise the tradition. It is absolutely true of a tradition in which, from master to disciple, there has been handed down through the generations something as nebulous as an awareness, a manner of being, a process of learning, an alteration of perception, the development of an inner conviction, an imprecisely defined method for achieving an incommunicable experience. Even the word we have chosen to describe the tradition, not one picked for that purpose by those whose tradition it naturally was, is surrounded by a haze of discussion, even of acrimonious argument. What is the derivation of Sufi? It comes, say some, from Ashabi Sufa, sitters in the shrine, mendicants who made their home in the porch of the temple, and whom the Prophet Muhammad used at times to feed. But even those who accept this derivation dispute its meaning. The Ashabi Sufa, they say, were those who sat on benches outside the mosques and debated matters theological with the orthodox. Others choose a different root for the word, settling on safa, purity or sincerity, to mark the special characteristic of those who set out upon the Sufi way. Some believe that the Greek sophia, wisdom or knowledge, lies near the root of the matter. Many think suf, wool, to be the relevant word for those who took to the self-disciplined life of the ascetic, wore long robes of wool, cowled, distinctive, and practical for a wanderer forced often to sleep on the hard earth. But for others again, the word needs no derivation, being simply itself. The sound suf, they say, has its own power, a value based on the universe's hidden currents of meaning. The debate over the name, however, is no more than a surface indication of the more important dispute about the origins of the Sufi teaching itself. This, in turn, concerns the qualifications considered necessary in those wishing to learn the Sufi way to self-development. Many commentators, indeed most, insist that the tariqah, the spiritual path, is open only to those who come to it by way of the Sharia, the holy law of Islam, based on the Quran and dependent upon theological exegesis. Thus, to be a Sufi, you have first to be a Muslim. The reason for this, they say, is that the origins of Sufism and those of Islam are inextricably intertwined, and the Prophet himself, as his profound mystic experiences prove, was not merely a Sufi, but the first and greatest of Sufis. If this were truly the case, then the ideas and practices of Sufism would be, even in part, inaccessible to all those who have not first adopted Islam. Yet writers and teachers have for years busily spread the news of precisely these ideas and practices throughout the West. Has their interest been a purely scholarly one, or, when it has not, have they been either misguided or fraudulent in their endeavors? J. Spencer Trimingham, in his The Sufi Orders in Islam, writes that Sufis differed considerably in their inner beliefs, but their link with orthodoxy was guaranteed by their acceptance of the law and ritual practices of Islam. All the same, they formed inner coteries in Islam and introduced a hierarchical structure and modes of spiritual outlook and worship foreign to its essential genius. It is a view that suggests that an approach to the Sufi structure and modes of action might not, after all, have to pass by way of orthodox Islamic law. One may not, on the other hand, have to go as far as some and see the origins of Sufism not in Islam at all, but in such mystic traditions as those of the Zoroastrian Magi of Persia. What do the great names of Sufi traditions say? Jalaluddin Rumi is still called, 7 centuries after his death, Maulana, our master, by the Sufis, and not only the Sufis of today. He is, above all others perhaps, the essential voice of Sufism, positive, unconventional, at times sardonic, at times admonitory or anecdotal, his verse impregnated with an awareness of profound love, but a love that makes it sinewy, not sugary, and of the exaltation of transcendental experience. He casts aside the trammels of theology when he deals with the central, inescapable issue, the relation between humanity and the divine. I adore not of the cross nor the crescent. I am not Christian nor Jew. Not from Eden and paradise I fell, not from Adam my lineage I drew. In a place beyond uttermost place, in a tract without shadow or trace, soul and body transcending I live in the soul of my loved one anew. The loved one here is both the Sufi guide and the divine itself. And a contemporary of his, the Sufi master Nafasi, wrote of God's proximity to mankind, "The beautiful truth is that he is ever near to those who seek him, regardless of their creed or belief." Scholars argue that Rumi, and the other great thinkers and teachers through whom Sufism developed, can only be considered in the Islamic context within which they grew and worked. It was that religion which they practiced, its tenets and rituals that they drew from and illuminated. And in a broad sense this must be true, since we are all the products of the cultures from which we spring. But to say that Sufism, an approach to the absolute by way of self-discipline, heightened perception, retrained intelligence and profound emotion, must be restricted to those who come to it through the gateway of Islam's Sharia seems on the face of it almost perversely narrow. When, in the mid-14th century, the ruler of Fars decreed in an excess of Puritan zeal that all the inns of the town must close, Hafiz, among the greatest of Sufi poets, and one who understood better than most the metaphor God intoxicated, wrote, "They have closed the doors of the wine taverns. O God, suffer not that they should open the doors of the house of deceit and hypocrisy. If they have closed them for the sake of the selfish zealot, be of good cheer, for they will reopen them for God's sake." And what is one to make of this short tale from Rumi's discourses? I spoke one day to a group of people, among whom there were some non-Muslims. In the midst of my speech, they wept and experienced ecstasy. Only 1 out of 1,000 Muslims understood why they wept. The master then declared, although they do not understand the inner spirit of these words, they comprehend the underlying feeling, the real root of the matter. If we who are not Muslims listen carefully, may we too not comprehend the root of the matter. It seems likely that certain elements in the Sufi tradition are indeed older than Islam itself. It is hard to believe that a mystic tradition should have had a sudden untrammeled beginning in the 7th century without being heavily influenced by existing ideas, especially when one remembers that Islam itself is a self-aware continuation of the monotheism already long developed in Judaism and Christianity. There is also the discomfort with which, as Trimmingham and others have suggested, Sufism seems at times to sit within Islam, a consequence perhaps of the incompatibility between the religion of revelation and the religion of continuing mystical experience. A once-for-all appearance on the human plane of the divine, as postulated by Christians, for example, tends to be codified in precepts, transfixed by tradition and animated only by ritual. On the whole, later generations are not permitted to obscure it by their own directly personal experience of the Absolute. Yet in Islam both traditions coexist, suggesting that some part of the mystical convention may have its beginnings not in the primary prophetic message, but elsewhere. For that convention supplies legitimacy to its adherents, equivalent to that supplied by revelation to the theologians, through a continuing chain of inductor and inducted, linked always by the relation between an unforced authority and a willing submission, and stretching back across the centuries. It is this chain of master and disciple, known in Sufism as the silsila, that itself provides the necessary authority for the latest neophyte desiring to add his link to it. The master personifies that authority, as he does the inner experience which is both the basis and the purpose for that authority's existence. Again, such systems of tuition, where they exist elsewhere in the world, in Hinduism's Guru Shishya Parampara, for instance, have their roots in a preliterate world where all instruction had to be oral, and those who taught were therefore the living embodiment of the culture they transmitted. There are many other reasons, of course, why tuition in mysticism should be by means of a similar direct transmission, and yet one wonders whether its very structures do not reveal how very deep and ancient the roots of Sufism are. The argument, however, has centered on what the exclusive origins of Sufism might be. One profound lesson that the philosophies of Asia can teach is that many desperate disagreements based on the disruptive either-or of which scholastic thinkers are so fond can be resolved by a reconciling both. This is probably such a case. If historical Islam itself has roots in monotheism already well known in Arabia, so may Sufism have arisen out of already established mystical schools. Yet the story of Muhammad and his mission, of his relation with the divine and the transmission of the Quran, is, of course, one in which profound mystical certainties are both implicit and explicitly described. Nor is there any question that the images and metaphors, the philosophical concepts and the cultural counters of the Sufi sages have always been those of Islam. It seems probable that, like so much else, the beginnings of Sufism are multiple, complex. As Idries Shah writes in his The Sufis, that is why, in Sufi tradition, the chain of transmission of Sufi schools may reach back to the Prophet by one line and to Elias by another. Nor need there be any conflict between the mystics and the orthodox. Because the Sufis recognized Islam as a manifestation of the essential upsurge of transcendental teaching, there could be no interior conflict between Islam and Sufism. Sufism was taken to correspond to the inner reality of Islam, as with the equivalent aspect of every other religion and genuine tradition. Like all mystical doctrines, Sufism, a term incidentally unknown until recent decades, it was coined by a German in the 1820s, and thus never used by the famous Sufi poets and philosophers of the past, postulates an absolute and goes on to assert that we can attain an awareness of it. This absolute has been defined in terms both secular and religious. It has been called the reality of existence, the reality of being. Being is of its nature singular, since nothing that exists does so to a greater degree than anything else. It either is, or it is not. This singularity is the divine. Set within the ideologies of Islam, it becomes specific. Personified, it becomes the object of a transcendent love. Yet one may ask, how can there be an object when the devotee, too, is necessarily part of and one with the cosmic unity? It seems, therefore, that we face a paradox. God is separate from the worshipper, and at the same time is the worshipper himself. The passionate element in Sufism, like that of the Hindu bhaktis, can only come from a perceived duality that acts as a barrier between God and the worshipper. It is the barrier itself, however, that resolves this paradox. Its resistance sets up precisely the intense devotional energy which the worshipper must develop in order to burst through it. Beyond lies that in which no paradox survives, the intense awareness of oneness, of the magnificent unity of the cosmos, absolute and indivisible. This perceived singularity, in which at one level one remains oneself, at another one totally loses oneself, is the real, and it is with this reality that Sufism is concerned. To reach it, to understand it, to see it clearly, in different words, to reach and understand God, is the object of its disciplines. At the end of the Sufi path, therefore, as at the far limit of other spiritual or mystical processes, there seems to lie an all-devouring blaze in which duality and self both vanish. And the pathway is marked, both in general terms and with the special signposts of Sufism. Professor A.M.A. Shushtari, in his Outlines of Islamic Culture, tells us, a Sufi believes that it is by purifying his heart, and not by observances of religious rituals, or prayer, or fast, one can realize the truth. It is through self-discipline, devotion, virtue, and intention that one can know his God. This stage is called Fana Fillah, or annihilation in God. The route is by way of maqam, translated as stations, each of which corresponds to a particular spiritual attainment. Also on the way are experiences of ecstasy, hal or ahwal, meaning state or states, which, like the stations, have finally to be transcended. The stations are reached by a series of exercises prescribed by one's teachers, but for the experience of hal there is no prescription. Hal, wrote Ali al-Hujwiri in the 11th century, is something that descends into a man without his being able to repel it when it comes, or to attract it when it goes. Yet in Sufism one often comes across mistrust not only of the stations as ends in themselves, but also of the ecstatic states. It is not that they are considered spurious. On the contrary, it is precisely the genuineness of the divine energy that makes Sufi writers doubt the fitness of those minds that so abruptly, and sometimes so catastrophically, receive it. It is as though the Sufi path had on either side of it pleasant bowers, shady places, welcoming groves, and in each of these there was a group of people murmuring to each other, "See, we have arrived." Some repeat certain exercises, convinced that to continue in this way is the object of their journey. Others, again, stand with eyes rolled up, or whirl with widespread arms, or roll on the ground, a light froth upon their lips. They cry out the names of God and feel themselves filled with a divine response. Yet, faintly, perhaps through difficult country, perhaps up an ever-increasing slope, the path winds on, and the traveller truly concerned to reach its end must leave these others behind, each of them comforted by apparent certainty, each of them deceived. It is he, stubborn in his quest and not disturbed by the passage of the years or the hardships of the journey, who has the only chance of reaching the true goal. Within his Revelation of the Veiled, Ali al-Hujwiri tells us, all the sheikhs of the path are agreed that when a man has escaped from the captivity of the stations and gets rid of the impurity of the states and is liberated from the abode of change and decay and becomes endowed with all praiseworthy qualities, he is disjoined from all qualities. In other words, beyond maqam, beyond hal, there is another state, the condition of peace, of self-realization, partaking of the cosmic unity. That final state he calls tamkin. Seen by one in that stable condition, doubtless the followers of the exercises seem little better than apprentices, while those in the grip of ecstasy must appear simply unprepared, unready for the force that has entered them. Thus, what in many other traditions would be taken as proof of a spiritual journey properly undertaken and joyfully completed, indicates to Sufis little more than that journey is underway. A bewildering array of sages, saints, and self-styled masters moves towards us from the recesses of Asia, and we may be forgiven when in our minds their several doctrines begin to merge into one ill-defined, if attractive, mishmash of hand-me-down exoticism. Yet we should be careful. Each tradition has been moulded by its own centuries, and by the society from which it has sprung. If we are to deal with the Hindu guru, for example, we must remember that reincarnation and the concept of karma are of the essence of his teaching. With the Sufis, as we have seen, it is Islam that provides the terminology and much of the ritual. The Buddhists of Tibet and those of the discipline we know as Zen wrap their teachings in the preconceptions and vocabulary of the lands where those teachings developed. Each tradition appeals in a different way, demands a different kind of discipline, suggests its goals in different terms. There is, in the end, it seems, no Eastern philosophy, no Asiatic religion. The difference between one and another discipline may be crucial, either for an individual's own development or possibly for the development of the West as a whole. If it is true that the people of Europe, and those whose cultures stem from that of Europe, are now in a new condition of bewilderment and doubt, if it is true that Christianity, a religion of ethics and of revelation, cannot become again what it was before scientific materialism routed it, if it is true that more and more Westerners are embarked upon the search for an individual experience of the transcendent, and upon the self-discovery that must both precede and follow that experience, if all this is true, then the attitude that we take up now to this or that particular teaching may well have repercussions over many years. Our Western culture is changing, and threatened or excited by that possibility, we have begun to look beyond the borders of the West for guidance. It is necessary that we look clearly and learn to distinguish between the various solutions suggested by the cultures and traditions which we may examine. Messiah Eliade, in his essay Experiences of the Mystic Light, writes, "In the course of human history, there have been 1,000 different ways of conceiving and evaluating the spirit. For all conceptualization is irremediably linked with language, and consequently with culture and history. One can say that the meaning of the supernatural light is directly conveyed to the soul of the man who experiences it, and yet its meaning can only come fully to his consciousness clothed in a pre-existent ideology. It is the present dilemma of the West that it has no such pre-existent ideology. The politics of ecclesiastical domination and the essential dualism of Christianity have reduced the cultural impact of the monistic experience of the mystics to relative insignificance. The separation made by religion between mankind and God, and by science between mankind and nature, has denied us a framework for any notion of cosmic unity, even for any real conception of an inner self not couched in the arid terms of psychoanalytical theory. If we are to pursue such a notion, such a conception, it seems to me we had better try to do so through disciplines that fit in as nearly as possible with those ideas about society, about culture, about the spirit and about the cosmos that we have developed. It may be that an implication of the greatest significance to the West is contained in one of the names by which Sufis are known, al-ishara, those who learn by allusion. For Sufi preceptors, it is the effect of their teaching and not the teaching itself which is of the first importance. Not what is said or done, but what happens to the listener as a result of what is said or done is the teacher's primary concern. What a Sufi says or writes need not be factually true. It is an instrument intended to work upon the minds of those who come across it. Metaphor, hyperbole, joke or boredom, all these are tools that the Sufi master may use to harmonize with his disciples. For this reason, quite apart from the prevailing priorities of Islamic and essentially Persian culture, many of the great Sufi luminaries of the past have been poets. So often active at levels more numerous and deeper than we are conscious of, able at times to yield layer after layer of meaning to our fascinated scrutiny, lingering in the mind with an echoing after impact that sometimes lasts as long as memory itself, poetry is the ideal medium for those who want to move us, as it were obliquely, through allusion. As a result, those who follow the Sufi path soon begin to learn in a manner new to them. The process of learning itself, rather than anything factually learnt, begins to alter them, to alter the way they think and the way they perceive the world. Long before the Sufi way turns into a purely mystical discipline, therefore, it works at the level of the intellect and the imagination. Its first stages are intended to prepare one for the later experiences, in order that one should not mistake their nature. Properly directed by a teacher who understands his individual needs, the disciple will achieve the sought-after ecstasy central to mysticism only when completely ready for it. Then, far from overwhelming him, it will complete him. It is not for nothing that Sufis therefore equate the absolute with reality. The process of learning is the process of discovering what really exists. In order to do this, the neophyte upon the path must be persuaded to use his senses, his intelligence, and his imagination in a new fashion. He must be helped toward a new kind, as well as a new level of consciousness. Here, Sufism, like certain other similar disciplines, begin to link with present developments in psychology. As Professor Robert Ornstein has written in his The Psychology of Consciousness, We know that our normal consciousness is not complete, but is an exquisitely evolved, selective, personal construction whose primary purpose is to ensure biological survival. But this mode, although necessary for survival, is not necessarily the only one in which consciousness can operate. The automatization of ordinary consciousness is a trade-off. For the sake of survival, we lose much of the richness of experience. The de-automatization of consciousness is the key. It enables us personally to note factors which had previously escaped attention. It is here that the work of the esoteric traditions is most fruitfully incorporated into Western science. The many automatic responses we make to our environment, although necessary for sanity and efficiency, stand between us and the world's reality. To reach the real, we have to learn to respond to it. We have, in other words, to become real ourselves. A way in which one may differentiate between various mystical traditions is to see what attitude they take to reality, the hard, intractable reality of the physical and social world we all inhabit. One view is that of Hinduism, which conceives of the undifferentiated unity glimpsed during the ecstatic experience as the only true reality. It therefore insists upon the illusory nature of the differentiated world available to ordinary sense experience. The disciples of the spiritual guru are enjoined, as are in the course of time all orthodox Hindus, to withdraw from that illusory world and to base themselves upon the cosmic unity that is Brahman. If everything is finally one, then family attachments, relationships, activity in the world, all of which reflect subject-object dependencies, must be fundamentally misguided. The disciple therefore casts them off, removes himself to an ashram, and there attempts to match the singularity of the cosmos with his own. Withdrawal of a similar nature, to hermitage and cloister, marks the history of Christian mysticism. For reasons practical and political as well as philosophical, it has largely been the preserve of the enclosed orders, or else by definition of the Church, of heretics. The whole burden of what such disciplines teach is that the serious person, the person dedicated to the search for ultimate reality, must turn away from the illusion of differentiated normality, as a Hindu might say, or from the temptations of the world, as a Christian might put it. Yet such withdrawal is not necessary in other traditions. Zen Buddhists, for example, while seeking samadhi, or the ecstatic annihilation of self, do not make this the end of their endeavors. On the contrary, writes Katsuki Sekida in Zen Training, if you want to attain genuine enlightenment and emancipation, you must go completely through this condition. In his maturity, the student of Zen goes out into the actual world of routine and lets his mind work with no hindrance. If we accept that there is an object in Zen practice, then it is this freedom of the mind in actual living. This is the fourth category of samadhi, the one that lies beyond mere ecstasy, and, as we have seen, Sufi beliefs too accommodate such a condition in that level of consciousness called by Hujwiri tamkin and elsewhere bhaga. Although both Zen and Sufi teachings have led to the formation of monastic orders, within which those devoted to the ascetic life tend to their own spiritual development, and perhaps learn in time to help others through the same process, many of the followers have always been laymen. The Sufi orders have, through the centuries of their existence, been surrounded by the non-monastics who are tied to them by vows and ceremonies of initiation. In Islam, above all, there can surely be no incompatibility between the secular and the mystical life, when the Prophet upon whose message it stands was himself a merchant, a politician and a military leader, as well as a religious philosopher and a mystic. Indeed, the impact of Muhammad's life depends upon the contrast between his outer ordinariness and the blazing light of divinity with which he was filled. Thus it comes as no surprise to find a Sufi thinker, Abu Nasr Sarraj, pointing out as early as the 10th century that extreme asceticism could be as debilitating to the spirit as luxury, and doubting the value of the hermit's seclusion for the good reason that the sources of evil lie within the self. Human beings, whatever their spiritual condition, ought, he considered, to fulfill their obligations in the world. Self-illumination would make them even better able to do so. From the beginning, therefore, a large proportion of Sufis have maintained their connection with the ordinary world, and in the list of Sufism's great men there stand many who, by no stretch of the imagination, could be considered ascetic or monastic. For them, the effects of what they knew, had seen and understood were brought into play in their dealings with the world about them. What they believed shone through what they wrote and did. They had prepared their minds for the mystical experience, and when it came, when it had filled them, they became not frenzied, but infinitely richer. That wealth they then brought to bear on those around them, those who came to them, those who heard and read their treatises. It was yet another 10th century Sufi sage, Abu Bakr al-Kalabadi, who wrote, "If a man's ecstasy is weak, he exhibits ecstasy. If, however, his ecstasy is strong, he controls himself and is passive." In that state of controlled ecstasy, calmed inwardly by the certainty that only enlightenment can bring, the Sufi is free to move about the world, to act in it, to take his place in it, and often to excel in it. He has achieved a new level of perception, a new kind of understanding, a new breadth of consciousness. He has experienced the cosmos as unity, and so has understood his own significance. He is the enlightened man. It is no wonder that the great luminaries of Islam, whose works no passing of the generation seems able to diminish, have in so many cases been Sufis. As we have seen, it is claimed even by the most orthodox doctors of religious law that the first Sufi was the Prophet himself. But the long line of the distinguished winds down the centuries of Islam as though by their brightness to mark out the path of their tradition. That is not to say that with each of them the tradition made a greater or lesser degree of progress, but rather that each lights the segment of the path where his illumination will be of the greatest use. Nevertheless, Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali must stand as the figure, reconciliatory, scholarly, deeply philosophical, and profoundly religious, with whom Sufism made a new beginning. It was he who gathered together the doctrines and ideas of his Sufi predecessors, selected, synthesized, and finally reconciled his conclusions with the orthodoxies of Islam. But underlying his patient and creative scholasticism there burned a constant mystic fire, and the life that he breathed into the academic clay, once he had gathered it and kneaded it into shape, was that of the Sufi certainties. Born in northeastern Persia in 1058, he was brought up and educated by a Sufi master. Before he was 35, he had been appointed to the chair of philosophy and theology at Nazimiya University, one of the greatest establishments that made Baghdad the center of Islamic culture. Although al-Ghazali, the youngest of the university's professors, was instantly acclaimed, he turned his back on fame and success after only 5 years. It was not that he disliked praise, indeed he confessed that he liked it too well, but rather that he had come to the end of what he might usefully arrive at through the techniques of scholasticism, had reached the limits, both as student and as teacher, of what in the academic world had value for him. As he wrote later, "I next turned with set purpose to the methods of Sufism. I knew that the Sufi way includes both intellectual belief and practical activity. The intellectual belief was easier, but it became clear to me, however, that what is most distinctive of mysticism is something which cannot be apprehended by study, but only by immediate experience, by ecstasy and by moral change. I apprehended clearly that the mystics were men who had real experience, not men of words, and that I had already progressed as far as was possible by way of intellectual apprehension. In the work he was yet to do, there would be, within the academic integument that gave it both form and legitimacy, an elusive other certainty baffling to scholars, a hint of secrets which, although by their nature no words can communicate them, he was taken wilfully to have left unrevealed. Nevertheless, he was to write and speak a great deal, his works finally becoming among the most influential ever published. After wandering for 12 years, the classical period of dervish training, during which he had no other objective than that of seeking solitariness, overcoming selfishness, fighting passions, trying to make clear my soul to complete my character, he returned, changed but active, to the world. The work he did during his lifetime earned him the amazing title of the Authority of Islam, but after his death, his work spread even wider than the religion's boundaries. He had woven into his philosophy the ideas of both Jewish and Christian mysticism, had adapted the transcendental world scheme of Plotinus and the Neoplatonists. Now his new synthesis, fruitfully translated, returned these theories and certainties, embellished and increased, to the cultures from which he had drawn them. In Hebrew and Latin his books spread through the academies and among the churchmen of Europe. That 13th century imperial genius, the Hohenstaufen Frederick II, as Holy Roman Emperor, the ruler of Sicily, and happily engaged there in creating his own synthesis between Europe and the Middle East, had El-Ghazali's books translated into Latin. St. Thomas Aquinas, another great synthesizer, drew on his theories, as he did on those of the pagan Plotinus. El-Ghazali, known to the schoolmen of the West as Al-Ghazal, became a figure central to the work of the universities of Padua and Bologna, and later of other Italian centres of learning. A few years on, Occam, whose razor logicians still like to flourish, was basing much of his anti-scholastic views on El-Ghazali's treatises. The ascetic struggling in the arid depths of Syria with the problems of self-development had become, posthumously and perhaps despite his wishes, a world figure, and paradoxically one often beloved of the very academics who by their training were perhaps among the least able to understand him. El-Ghazali's was a liberating effect upon Islamic thought. The increasingly narrow orthodoxies of the doctors of law were challenged and, indeed, superseded by the refreshing speculation he pioneered and endorsed. His attitude to philosophy opened new approaches to religion, as well as to other facets of human spiritual and psychological existence. His belief that thought was natural and right was reinforced by his conviction that human will was free and that human beings had the God-given ability to choose between alternatives. However, he went beyond both philosophy and active choice in his certainty that the ultimate perceptions take place in the condition of ecstasy, and that the reality then perceived takes precedence over anything else mankind may know. For this reason, both theology and philosophy had to be finally subordinated to personal experience, through which a person may achieve revelations more piercing and direct than any truth arrived at by mere ratiocination. But in the end, like all great spiritual teachers, he was not his doctrines, but was in himself the truth he taught. What he knew with the very centre of himself no words could describe or pass to anyone else. In his Revival of Religious Sciences, he wrote, "The question of divine knowledge is so deep that it is really known only to those who have it. A child has no real knowledge of the attainments of an adult. An ordinary adult cannot understand the attainments of a learned man. In the same way, a learned man cannot understand the experiences of enlightened saints or Sufis. One can only write what can be written. For the rest, one either is it, or one is not. Jalaluddin Rumi, whom Sufis call the Master and Professor Fatemi entitles The Light of Sufism, was born in Balkh, now in Afghanistan, in 1207. His father was a famous scholar and theologian, so that Rumi's early training was in the rigorously classical and logical modes. When he was 12, his family left Balkh and, after some time spent in travelling about the Middle East, finally settled in Konya, anciently Iconium, in what is now Turkey. Rumi married, was left a widower, married again. From both marriages he had children. He early became a teacher, but soon he was himself wandering through Western Asia in the company of a Sufi master named Burhan al-Din, his task now self-development. When after some years he returned to Konya, he resumed the teaching of theology, but added to it a new spiritual resonance through the guidance he was able to give. As a result, he quickly achieved a position of great religious, and thus in Islam, social and even secular importance. When he was at the height of this relatively conventional fame, he met the Sufi teacher Shamsudeen of Tabriz. This strange and powerful man, who seemed to some no more than a noisy, arrogant blusterer, at once dislocated Rumi's life. In the esoteric traditions of Asia, relying as they do on the transmission of a mystic essence from a teacher to a disciple, there occurs again and again that moment of recognition in which master and student understand, wordlessly at once, that they are destined to work together. Such a moment evidently occurred between Rumi and Shamsudeen. The revered theologian, seized with an intoxication that expressed itself at times in solitary dance, placed himself without reservation among the wandering Sufi's pupils. As his son wrote, the great professor became a beginner in self-perfection. The orthodox criticized, bewailed the loss of their teacher, or decided simply that Rumi was mad. Shamsudeen, after 15 months, left Konya, but Rumi continued his inward, intensely devoted progress. Perhaps then, perhaps a little later, in 1248, Shamsudeen died, apparently in violence caused by the jealousies and antagonisms Rumi's strange behavior had provoked. Eventually, however, Rumi, who was no longer to be deflected, reconciled the increasing pressures of his inward search with the social demands of the people of Konya, or more accurately, reconciled the people of Konya to the demands of his inward search, in part by guiding them in their own. To understand the role that Shamsudeen, internalized by his pupil, his religious essence transferred, played thenceforth in the life of Rumi, one must understand the nature of the feeling that exists in living mystical traditions between murshid and murid, guru and shishya, between teacher and taught. The master becomes a living metaphor for the perfection of the absolute. He seems for the disciple at once the stepping stone to divinity and, as a self-realized man, divinity made flesh. At the same time, there exists in both the conviction that between them the transmission of a quality, indefinable yet unmistakable, can take place, through which the disciple will be permanently altered. When this transmission has occurred, the disciple is in no doubt about what he has gained, nor will the departure or death of the master diminish one iota of it. He has been flooded by a perception of the absolute so clear that almost nothing he can do will make him lose it, especially since all he does is done only in its light. In him, therefore, the fact of the teacher and the fact of the divine merge into an inextricable whole, fusing with his own essence to produce a new level of being. Thus Rumi could write, "When I go into the mine, he is the carnelian and ruby. When I go into the sea, he is the pearl. When I am on the plains, he is the garden rose. When I come to the heavens, he is the star. My master and my sheikh, my pain and my remedy, I declare these words openly, my Shams and my God. I have reached truth because of you, O my soul of truth. These lines come from his Divani Shamsi Tabriz. He was now in the condition that Professor Araste has described in his Rumi the Persian. He was all love, all joy, all happiness. He had no grief, no anxiety. He was totally born, totally spontaneous. Rumi now felt able to set up a school of devotees of his own, and in it to guide others toward that state to which the fact of Shams had guided him. It was now, too, that he probably began to work on that 6-volume compilation of fables, poems, tales, examples, and speculations, the Mathnavi, through which, perhaps more than anywhere else in his work, he attempted to induce in the reader something of his own state of mind. As Idries Shah puts it, a picture is built up by multiple impact to infuse into the mind the Sufi message. In the Mevlevi order was later codified what had at times been his own practice of dancing, developing the steady whirling which is at one level a mechanical aid to the induction of trance, but is at another, I quote Shah again, designed to bring the seeker into affinity with the mystical current in order to be transformed by it. But for Rumi, trance was, as it must be for a Sufi, no more than a stage in the process of self-development. Again and again, in the Mathnavi, in his Fihi Mafihi, and elsewhere, he refers to the condition beyond trance, beyond belief, beyond mere creed or doctrine. Cross and the churches from end to end I surveyed, he was not on the cross. I went to the idol temple, to the ancient pagoda, no trace was visible there. I bent the reins of search to the Kaaba, he was not in the resort of old and young. I gazed into my own heart, there I saw him, he was nowhere else. And as he stated explicitly in the Divani Shamsi Tabriz, I have put duality away. One I seek, one I know, one I see, one I call. This monism Rumi experienced directly, and he interpreted the experience as love. He is above all the poet of transcendent love. He saw it clearly and never made it an excuse for rhetoric, imprecise although exciting. He had very definite ideas about the nature of the human being, and the struggle needed to transcend the polarity between reason and instinct in order to reach, once again, the state of peaceful certainty beyond. In that final condition, an individual was able to integrate instinct and reason with intuitive perception, and the love that would both keep him whole and permit him direct involvement with every aspect of the cosmos. Love, in other words, became at this level a medium for perceptions otherwise impossible to human beings. It is this vision of the person evolved that remains immediate and full of meaning. As we struggle earnestly to understand ourselves in a world where we seem, at precisely the same time and with precisely the same dedication, to be building endless barriers and creating endless pressures, Rumi's insights and oblique admonitions are more relevant than they have ever been. Born into a Sufi family almost exactly 100 years after al-Ghazali, almost exactly 40 years before Rumi, Ibn al-Arabi, like them, displayed great gifts even in childhood. Brought up in the heyday of Arabic Spain, paradoxically one of the most civilized societies in European history, he studied in Lisbon, Seville, and Córdoba. All his life he wrote poetry. In it he often returned to the theme of human love, deeply felt and magnificently described, used as a metaphor for the transcendent emotion that lies glittering at the core of all his work. Yet metaphor does inadequate justice to the reality he evidently experienced at both levels. Either reading, the sensual and the mystical, is a true reading. He was indeed frequently attacked for being no more than a writer of erotic poetry, who sought to cover his indulgence by claiming a spiritual meaning for it. The fact is that among the various levels of perception and feeling experienced by the developed person, some are not less real than others, nor does the last stage cancel all those that have gone before. Each is true in its own way. The error is to imagine any one of them the total reality. The divine is the only total reality, and that includes all aspects, all levels. Thus, for Ibn al-Arabi, his sensual response to feminine beauty was real, not imagined. Yet precisely because of its reality, he saw that beauty as a metaphor for the world's beauty, the beauty of nature, just as he saw in the relation between men and women a metaphor for that between humanity and God. For if Genesis is true, then woman is made in man's image as man is in God's. Thus, as God stands in love and concern to his creation, nature, so man stands to woman. The feeling is real in its own terms, yet only becomes complete in the metaphysical dimension. Today we may reject Genesis, and thus the metaphor may lose some of its particular force, but it is at our peril that we reject this awareness of the multiplicity of the real. Ibn al-Arabi made such ideas explicit in his prose treatises, for he was a scholar more complete even than his doctorial critics. His explanatory notes to his love poetry seem to have satisfied the most puritanical and rigorously orthodox theologians that he had nowhere deviated from the approved path of righteousness. Thus his encyclopedic survey of Sufi ideas, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, and his dissertation on various aspects of Sufism, Fusus al-Hikam, like his other books of theory and speculation, passed to succeeding generations not as the outpourings of a heedless poet, but as the considered works of a scholar acknowledged to be among the greatest of his time. As Rumi and other Sufis have, Ibn al-Arabi emphasized, for example in chapter 22 of Fusus al-Hikam, that beyond fana, the mystical annihilation of self, there exists another state in which that experience is, as it were, stabilized, made permanent. It was because of his awareness of this ultimate condition that he was able to accept the structures of orthodoxy. He realized that within every such structure, perhaps almost snuffed out by its weight, but certainly once ablaze, there could be found the flame of mysticism. All great teachers, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and others, had embodied that flame, and though human perversity might distort faith in the divine, as in the case of self-punishing ascetics, yet any true religion might be the mystic's starting point. It is no wonder that throughout his life, doctrinaire scholars and theologians, like men in narrow valleys which they believe to be the world, condemned his breadth of understanding as the dangerous deviations of a heretic. A near contemporary of Rumi, and as widely known wherever Persian poetry is remembered and recited, is Sadie of Shiraz. Born in 1184, he, like al-Ghazali, was educated at the Nizamiya University in Baghdad, studying there under the Sufi sage Jilani. Thereafter, he spent many years wandering, in the prescribed poverty of the dervish, through the Middle East, North Africa, Ethiopia, and Asia Minor. It was typical of his troubled period that at one point he was captured by crusaders and had to be ransomed. The price paid for this incomparable poet, employed while captive as a trench digger, was 10 dinars. Sadi's most famous works, his Gulistan and Bustan, Rose Garden and Orchard, are rich mixtures of aphorisms, proverbs, love lyrics, erotic stories, descriptions of great rulers, and above all, pronouncements in prose and verse on morality and ethics, on the right role of rulers and the proper attitudes of their advisers, on tyranny and its consequences, on human cruelty, human frailty, and human potential. All this he did in a style apparently straightforward, easily assimilable. The uncluttered affection that informs his writings had made them for 7 centuries a source from which ordinary people have drawn advice, information, and enjoyment. Yet in his lifetime the Mongols came crashing out of Central Asia, dismembering Persia and bringing to an end the great centuries of Baghdad's cultural supremacy. Seen against the circumstances of history, Sa'di's urbanity, his humanity, and not least his lightness of touch, seem superhuman. Yet Sa'di too, for all his ease of manner, saw the truth as complex and many-layered. In him this often expressed itself through paradox and contradiction. There is no facile consistency in the surface of his works. Those wishing to refute him can often find the arguments they need elsewhere in his own writings. As a result of this, and of his wordplay and wit, those who read or hear his works are constantly forced to become aware of the very act of understanding, and thus both of the works themselves and of their own responses. One cannot surrender to passive delight for long before some change of direction, some unexpected profundity, joke, or reversal jolts one into intellectual activity. What this suggests is that the consistency in what Sa'di wrote lies at another level, and perhaps in another place, not in the works, but in those who receive them. In their complexity they are, it seems, primers for self-development, instruments for the dynamic alteration of consciousness. He was a Sufi in his sense of the universality of religion, in his humanity, in his understanding of the links between flesh and spirit, but above all perhaps in this, that he knew that the value of what is taught lies in the minds of those whom it reaches. The work of Hafiz, too, has its unsuspected levels, its complexities. Born some 100 years after Rumi in Shiraz, he was during his early manhood installed in a school of his own, where he taught theology and expounded his theories of religion. He lost his father when a young child, and later both his wife and son. His poetry appears in the main a celebration of romantic love, modified by his awareness of himself as too old for such emotion. From this it has been inferred that the bulk of it was written when he was aged. Whether that is so or not, he was so acutely aware of the value of love that he detested those who, as it were, clouded its brightness, the censorious, the hypocritical, the sanctimonious, the pedantically orthodox. He believed in the liberty of the intellect and of the senses. No wonder that there were those who thought him both profligate and heretic. He, too, in his works ran the gamut of modes and feelings, for his poems were licentious, mystical, humorous, satirical, or epigrammatic by turns. At the centre of his writings, however, lie his cool, affectionate humanity, marked by a dislike for fanaticism, for the trappings of power and wealth, and his mystical certainties. Addressing a man of property who had attempted to add to his secular riches the acclaim proper to one returning from pilgrimage to Mecca, Hafiz wrote, "Boast not rashly of thy fortune, thou hast visited the temple, and I have seen the Lord of the temple." This is the nub of the matter, and the certainty which that conviction gave to Hafiz sustained him in a world where, in the wake of the Mongol assault, social and political structures were collapsing, religion had been coarsened, and civilization weakened, apparently forever. It is the certainty of the mystic, and Hafiz shared it with all the great names of Sufism. In that list there are many more, stretching from the 10th century ecstatic Hallaj, crucified by the Orthodox, and the founders of Sufism in the centuries before by way of philosophers and poets. The chemist Fariduddin Attar, the polymath Omar Khayyam, and many others, solitary saints, men in humble occupations hiding the secrets of their serenity, great leaders, heads of dervish orders, to the adepts of today. Yet for each neophyte setting forth on this difficult path, the only important person, eclipsing all the great, will be his chosen teacher. It is the teacher he must trust, the teacher who must know the right sequence of his development, through the teacher that he will discover the intellectual and emotional adjustments necessary to prepare him for the knowledge to come. At first, the knowledge will be short-lived, entering the student at will and leaving even if bidden to stay. I staggered to my feet and looked about me and tried to remember what had until that instant been crowded in my brain, and it was all gone. All the details covered over by the present and my humanity as a flash flood will cover the pebbles lying in the dry bottom of an ancient creek. It was all there, or at least some of it was there, for I could sense it lying there beneath the flash flood of my humanity. And I wondered vaguely as I stood there if this burial of the matters transmitted by my friend might not be for my own protection, if my mind, in a protective reflex action, had covered it and blanked it out in a fight for sanity. But in the end, the altered self emerges into the sought-for state of readiness, and the ultimate certainty responds, "It was all there again, all that I had known and felt, all that I had tried to recapture since and could not find again, all the glory and the wonder and some terror too, for in understanding there must be a certain terror. There were many universes and many sentient levels, and at certain time-space intervals they became apparent, and each of them was real as the many geologic levels that a geologist could count. Except that this was not a matter of counting, it was seeing and sensing and knowing they were there. Not knowing how, but filled with mystic faith, we took the step out of the infinite knowing and were there." The quotations come from no mystic's reminiscences, but from a science fiction novel, Destiny Doll by Clifford Simak. Those who think this inappropriate have understood very little of what has gone before. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.